Jan Spochnik. I'm in the physics department at Kalamazoo College. I'd like to welcome everybody here. I apologize for the tight space. I hope you will do okay. In case of any fire or other emergency, please exit slowly. All right. I'd just like to make a few thank yous, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Stallman. I'd like to thank my partner, Hillary Reddick, over here. I'd like to thank Elise Brady. Where's she? Elise Brady over there. Thank the physics and computer science departments for funding this. That's always important. All right. I don't think I have to say a lot about Dr. Richard Stallman.
So let me turn it over to me.
So I am just going to give it to him.
So, before I start, there are a couple of requests I have for you. Well, first of all, concerning photos. If you take a photo of me, don't put it in Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, which are three tentacles of the same company. Facebook recognizes people in photos by face recognition. So if you put a photo where someone else appears, the face or the back of the head, they recognize that too. You are helping that company track and surveil that person. It's bad treatment of anybody. Please don't do it to me. And also, if you want to take a photo of me with a mobile device, please make sure in advance that the functionality of putting the geolocation in the photo is turned off. Because if you distribute a photo with a geolocation in it where someone else appears, you're helping to track and surveil that person, which again is bad treatment. Also, if you want to record this talk, audio or video, and distribute copies, please distribute them only in the formats that are favorable to free software, which means the OGG formats and the WebM format. Please also make sure that the distribution site permits downloading a copy without running any non-free software, without the visitors having to run any non-free software. We're not talking about what they run in the server. That's their problem. But they shouldn't make people to get access to the video or audio have to run any non-free software themselves. That's mistreating the visitors. And I don't want a recording of my speech to do that to people. And finally, please put on the recording the Creative Commons No Derivatives license, because this is a presentation of a point of view. It's not teaching how to do something. So it's not teaching a subject. It's what I think and believe. So now, what is free software? Free software is software that respects users' freedom and community. Where we mean free as in freedom, we're not talking about price here. Whether it costs you money to get a copy of a program, that's a minor practical detail. That doesn't make it right or wrong. But once you get a copy, does it treat you ethically or does it mistreat you? That's the question at hand here. A non-free program is bad to you once you've got it. This is not about how you get it. It's about whether it's something that attacks people when they have it. So a non-free program is an unethical thing. It's worse than no program. And many times I have chosen no program rather than a proprietary non-free program. But what is a program? What's a computer? Well, a computer is a universal computing engine, But what it does is conceptually very simple. All it knows how to do is get the next instruction and do what that says. And get the next instruction and do what that says. And get the next instruction and do what that says. And get the next. Millions of times a second, it will get the next instruction and do whatever that says. But this is enough to do any kind of computation if you give it the appropriate set of instructions. The instructions come from a program, and depending on what instructions are in that program, it will make the computer do this or that or anything. The same computer can do basically anything within the limits of the possible. There's some things that computers just can't do yet. But within the limits of what's possible, the same computer can do anything according to what the program tells it to do, what instructions are in the program. So who gives the instructions to your computer? You may think it's you, when really it's someone else. You may think your computer is obeying you, when really it's obeying its real master first. And then it tries to serve you to whatever extent its real master will permit. With any program, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. There's no other possibility. When the users control the program, that's free software. Why is that? Freedom is having control of your own life, control of the activities you do in your life. But if you use a program to do the activity, control of the activity requires having control of the program that's doing it. So when users control the program, that program respects users' freedom and community. You'll see in a minute why I include community here. So that's free software. Concretely, in order for the program to be free software, the users need the 4 essential freedoms. And these give a more concrete and explicit criterion for being free software. Freedom 0 is to run the program however you wish for whatever purpose you have. Freedom 1 is to study the source code of the program and change it so the program does your computing activity the way you wish. Why source code? Why must we require that you have the freedom to study and change the source code? Well, here's some source code. You can see it's a mixture of English and math. If you've learned the programming language, you could understand what that source code means and then change it so it does something different. But in order to run it, we convert it into an executable program, which is a bunch of enigmatic 1s and 0s, which are hard even for a programmer to understand. Now, a program that short, it's not very hard to understand. Yes, a programmer could see what a program that size does. But for a real size program, the kind that you encounter every day, those are much too big to figure out easily as an executable. It's a very hard job. It's called reverse engineering. It's so hard that people do it only as a last resort. So if the users didn't get the source code and the developer said, oh, you're free to study and change this program, you'll have to do reverse engineering, of course, but so what? That's mockery of Freedom 1. That's not really giving the users the possibility of studying and changing the program. They must get the source code. So these 2 freedoms give every user separate control over the program. Here we see 4 users. 3 of them are using the program as they got it, but one of them is exercising Freedom 1 by changing per copy of the program. Well, Freedom 1, separate control like this is essential, but it's not enough because most users are not programmers. There are lots of other things for people to do in life. So they don't understand source code, but they still deserve to have control over their computing and thus which requires control over the software. How can they do it? How can they have any control if they don't understand the code? Through collective control. Collective control is the freedom to work together with others to exercise control over what that program does and how. At the top, we see a group of 3 users that are working together. 2 of them are actually touching the code. They must be programmers. The third one on the left is not touching the code. That one might not be a programmer, might not know how to change the code, but by participating in the group's decisions, person also participates in exercising control over that group's version of the program. Those who cooperate in this way are those who choose to. Any people can choose to cooperate or not. So at the bottom we have 2 more users who are not working as part of that group. And they're free not to. Why don't they? Well, maybe they don't agree with the group about what the program should do. Or maybe they don't like those 3, or the 3 don't like them. Or maybe they just never heard of each other. Maybe tomorrow they'll meet each other and start working together. It's entirely up to them. Collective control requires 2 more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is to make exact copies and give or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. Note that it's entirely legitimate to sell copies of free software. You're free to do it. We're not against paying or charging money. We're against taking away other people's freedom and subjugating them. So, if the program comes with these 4 freedoms, then it's free software because the users control the program so they can make it respect their freedom, and it respects their community because of collective control, because they're free to redistribute to each other. But if any of these freedoms is missing or insufficient, partly missing, then the users don't control the program. Instead, the program controls the users, and the proprietor controls the program. This non-free program is an instrument of unjust power, power for the proprietor over the users. A non-free program is an injustice and should not exist. And furthermore, for our freedom's sake, we need to kick it out of our lives. It's not subjugating you if you never use it. Now, simply being a non-free program is the basic injustice, but it leads to other injustices. Because nowadays the proprietor knows about their power over the users. In fact, probably developed it in order to get power over some users. So the proprietor feels the temptation to take advantage of that power to gain more money at the expense of the users. In other words, power corrupts here as elsewhere. So specifically, what they do is put malicious functionalities into the program. It's quite common, it's the usual case that non-free programs mistreat their users. Let me give you some examples. First of all, there's spying, like the Amazon swindle. I'm talking about Amazon's ebook reader. It reports everything. Every so often it tells Amazon what book is being read and what page number, even if the book wasn't obtained from Amazon. And if the user highlights any text, sent to Amazon. If the user enters any notes, sent to Amazon. Sometimes the program is tied to a particular server in order to run. For instance, the Fitbit is a very nasty device. It collects data about the user and sends it to a company, which then invites the user to buy that data. It probably sells that data to others as well. Maybe it's sold in anonymized form, so-called, which means that it doesn't actually include the user's name, address, or whatever. But that's no problem for the data brokers. They can correlate it with other data and figure out who the user is. It's called re-identification, and it's much easier than you would think. So a lot of products spy. Windows spies, Mac OS spies, the iThings, Apple's mobile monsters spy. Flash Player has a tracking feature. Mobile phones track their users. Lots of apps track their users. Even the flashlight apps, they've been observed to send messages to lots of websites. Why in the world? What information does it need in order to turn on the screen? None. It's just tracking the user. It's spying. And then there are other malicious apps like the Uber and Lyft apps that track the user. They're non-free software, and they make users identify themselves, which means that compared with ordinary taxis, Uber and Lyft cars are an injustice. They track people. This is why I'll never use either of them or anything like them. I hope you will reject them too. But it's not just spying on people. Oh, I should mention most of the streaming systems do this too. For instance, Spotify. Well, Spotify tracks what users listen to. That's spying. And people have to identify themselves in order to pay. So there we have an injustice. Out, out, damned Spotify. And of course, Netflix is just as bad. I will never use either of those. I've refused to watch a movie through Netflix even if someone else's computer was playing it. I've refused to listen to it, to even a snatch of a song through Spotify. Because these are so bad, we have to show that we hate them. We have to build up the will to resist this sort of tracking. But it's not just that. There's also the functionality of refusing to function. DRM, Digital Restrictions Management. When systems are designed to restrict their users, to stop their users from doing what the designers know users are going to want to do. So here's the infamous blue ray that attacks people when they try to copy the video. There's no free software, as far as I've heard, that can defeat the DRM of a Blu-ray disc. So I've never used a Blu-ray disc, and I expect I never will. I'd rather miss all the movies in the world than surrender to this. There's never been a movie that I wanted to see so much that I would tolerate this. But DRM, or digital handcuffs, are found in lots of products. The base for it is found in all the non-free operating systems like Windows and Mac OS and iOS and Android. It's found in the Amazon Swindle. It's found in Flash Player. And of course, lots of applications implement these digital handcuffs including the applications for Spotify and Netflix. So I think the right principle is never use a device designed to restrict you unless you have personally to hand what is necessary to break the handcuffs. And then there are back doors, which allow someone to send a command remotely telling the machine to do something nasty to the user. The Amazon Swindle has a backdoor for remotely erasing books. It's hard to tell by investigation that there is a backdoor. It's not visible except when it operates. In 2009, a lot of users of the Amazon Swindle noticed that Amazon had remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book in a big, blatant Orwellian act. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. If I were writing fiction, I wouldn't dare make that up. It would be impossible to believe. But that was the fact. Somebody in one of my talks told me he had seen the book disappear as he was in the middle of reading it. Well, there are various other products that have backdoors. Then there's censorship. Apple was the pioneer of censorship in the iThings. Apple imposed censorship of applications. It was impossible to install the applications of your choice freely. The user could only install applications approved by Apple from Apple's store. When users found tricks to circumvent the censorship, they called it jailbreaking, recognizing in effect that that product was a jail. It was designed to be a jail for its users. Then Microsoft followed the same path. There are also universal backdoors, which means a backdoor that can do absolutely anything. It's universal in the same way a computer is universal. Give the computer the right program and it will do whatever it might be. Well, a universal backdoor allows the remote changes in the software, so it can be used to do any nasty thing to the user. Basically, if a user has Windows running in a computer, since Windows has a universal backdoor, Microsoft has owned that computer. There is zero security in a computer running Windows. But what was I going to say? I've drawn a total blank. The universal backdoor was first discovered in Windows XP by investigation because Microsoft refused to admit it. But starting in Windows 7, Microsoft acknowledged it by giving it a nice sounding name. It's called Auto Upgrade. Auto Upgrade means forcing software changes on users. Meanwhile, Microsoft does another kind of sabotage. Oh, I forgot to I should mention the Amazon Swindle has a universal backdoor, and so does every mobile phone. So that has been used to convert mobile phones into listening devices. Any mobile phone doesn't have to be a smartphone. The older phones can also have this malicious functionality. They can be converted into listening devices that listen 24/7 and transmit all the conversations they hear, and they hear all the conversations in the room. And if you think you can recover your privacy by switching it off, the joke's on you. It pretends to switch off, but it keeps running, listening, and transmitting. It never stops, except when it runs its battery down. And And maybe you can stop it by removing all the batteries. But you may not be able to remove all the batteries. So, because of this and because the movements of the phone are being tracked all the time by triangulation of the signals that it emits, a mobile phone is Stalin's dream. If Stalin could have given every inhabitant of the Soviet Union a device that would report on where that person goes and listen to the conversations around that person, that's exactly what Stalin would have loved to do. But the technology, unfortunately for Stalin, didn't exist back then. Now it exists. And I expect that most of you have been convinced to carry one because you didn't resist hard enough or you didn't know. I was lucky. I found out about these vicious things when I was still considering whether to have a mobile phone. And when I saw how horrible it was, I concluded that it's my duty as a citizen to refuse, no matter how convenient it might be. Some things we must not tolerate. Oh, there's another nasty thing that Microsoft does. When Microsoft discovers a security error in Windows, it shows that to the NSA first and then fixes it. Betraying, effectively, all of its users. Now, these are just a few examples. We have dozens and dozens of examples, each one with a reference in the press to document it. They're in gnu.org/proprietary, so you can look them all up. What it means is almost everyone that's using proprietary software is using proprietary malware. Malware means a program designed to mistreat the user. When people discuss the issue of malware, they tend to do it with a form of blindness. They talk about the malware that wasn't supposed to be in the computer, and they ignore the malware that was supposed to be in the computer, like the proprietary operating system or applications or who knows what. But that's just as much malware, at least in the cases that we know about. Of course, there are thousands more proprietary programs which we don't know about, and each one might be malware or might not, and it's not easy to find out. But there's no way to verify it's not malware. So each of those programs is each proprietary program is either established, demonstrated malware, or possible malware. And why do they do this? They make more money this way. They've discovered ways to make money by mistreating their own users. So they do it because they have no scruples. What's happened is that over the years, the moral standards of proprietary software have gone down and down. In 1984, when I started developing GNU, it was shocking for a proprietary program to turn out to be malware. That was not normal then. But the standards have gone down, and now it's standard practice. So if you go to work in proprietary software, your coworkers will be accustomed to malware. They'll think of it as normal. And the boss will pressure you to work on and cooperate with making malware. And you'll either have to quit or let them corrupt you. So you can't trust proprietary software because it's quite likely to be malware, and if it isn't, you can't tell that. if you can never have a rational basis to trust a non-free program. You're being asked to give blind faith, and usually to a company that has already proved it doesn't deserve such trust, that has already violated that trust. If you want a rational basis to trust a program, it has to be free software. Because with free software, the users control the program, and we contributors know that. We know we don't have power over the users. We have some influence, but not power. Ultimately, the users can reject any of our decisions by changing it. We are safe from corruption because we don't have power, and we know it. And so, for your freedom's sake, you need to do what I've already done. Escape from non-free software and come live with us in the free world that we have built. With the GNU operating system and the Linux kernel, we built the free world. I started the development of the GNU operating system in 1984. GNU stands for GNU's Not Unix. I said, I'm going to develop a Unix-like operating system that will be entirely free software so that we can use computers in freedom. In 1991, GNU was almost complete, as you see there. All that was missing was the kernel. We had started a kernel in 1990, but I chose a design that was too advanced. It became a research project. It took 6 years to develop a test version. Sort of sad, but we didn't have to wait for that because in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had developed a kernel called Linux, a proprietary kernel in 1991, in 1992 he liberated it by releasing its source code with a free license. At that point, it was possible to use Linux to fill the last gap in the GNU system, making the combination, which is GNU plus Linux. For the first time in 1992, it became possible to use a PC in freedom by installing the GNU/Linux operating system. I'm sure you've heard people talking about GNU/Linux and erroneously calling it Linux, giving the credit for our work to someone else who started many years later and did a smaller piece of the job. And that's treating us badly. It's not fair. So please give us equal mention. When you're talking about this combination, please call it GNU/Linux or GNU plus Linux. I think equal mention is what we're entitled to. And I'm perfectly happy to give a share of the credit to Mr. Torvalds, who developed an important piece of the system. Now, in principle, GNU/Linux is a free operating system, but in practice, not always, because there are many distributions, different variants of GNU/Linux, each one maintained by a different group. And they decide what programs to put in their distribution. Typically, they add various programs, and usually some of them are non-free. Because there are always some useful things which nobody has made a free program for yet. So at that point, the values of the distro's developers make a difference. What do they care about? Do they care about freedom, or do they care about convenience? If they care about freedom, they will make a totally free distro, because they think it would be wrong to lead other people to run a non-free program and lose their freedom. But if what they care about is convenience, they'll put all the non-free programs that they think are convenient. And thus they'll be leading people to come closer to freedom, but not get there, not get all the way. And that's a serious problem. And it's worse because most of them value convenience, not freedom. So There are thousands of gnu/linux distributions, and almost all of them have some non-free programs. And then there are a few which don't, because they're developed by people who value freedom. Well, in gnu.org/distros, you can find out about the distros that are free. And their developers have made a commitment to keep them free, because we require that commitment to list them. Nobody's perfect, and a distro probably has thousands of programs in it. So it's too much to ask to say they'll promise they'll never make mistakes. Instead, we ask them to promise they'll fix mistakes if any mistakes are found. Now, the non-free distros cause two kinds of bad effects. One is people hear about them. For instance, Ubuntu is a non-free distro. It will install non-free software. People hear about it, though, and so they install it, and they come closer to freedom. You know, it's a lot better to run a non-free gnu/linux distro than to run Windows or Mac OS. But they don't get all the way to freedom, and they usually don't know that. They don't know that there's someplace further that they should have tried to go. And that's the other problem. You see, the developers and distributors of the non-free distros, their promoters, don't talk about this. The developers of Ubuntu could say, you deserve freedom in your computing and you won't get it from us. But of course they don't. Instead they say, we aim to offer you the best possible user experience. So how do you teach values? By incorporating them in your words and your deeds. The words and the deeds of Ubuntu teach people to value convenience and not to value freedom. So at that level, they're working against the free software movement. So look at gnu.org/distros for more info about this. Now, how do you make a program free? You've got to release it with a free license. A program is automatically copyrighted, and copyright law by default forbids copying it, redistributing it, changing it, and in many cases even running it, depending on the country. So how do you make it free? With a declaration by the copyright holders that gives anyone that has a copy the 4 freedoms. That's why the users have the 4 freedoms. Legally, it's because of the free software license. Legally, the free software license is where the copyright holders gave the users those freedoms. Without the license, it's not free. If you go to a rather unfortunate site, GitHub, you'll find many programs with no license. Well, they're not free software. And sometimes you'll find a program where there's something that says this is released under such and such license, but there's nothing in the source file saying so. Well, that's not clear. They're basically taking the user's freedom and throwing it up in the air and hoping that it won't fall off the edge of the cliff. I mean, it's a very bad practice. Every source file should say what its license is, unless it's so short that for copyright purposes it doesn't even matter. And those notices are also where you say which versions of the GNU General Public License you're using, if you're using the GNU General Public License. So those notices are vitally important. There are 2 main categories of free licenses. Because after all, there are many ways you can write a statement that gives people the 4 freedoms. There are substantial differences between free software licenses. Let me remind you what the 4 freedoms are, because the way for people to remember things is to tell them more than once. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and change it so the program does your computing activities the way you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to make copies, exact copies of the program, and give or sell them to others when you wish. And Freedom 3 is the freedom to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. So, one category of free software licenses is the pushover licenses, the weak, lax permissive licenses that basically say, do anything you like with this program. They basically don't know how to say no. And the result is, a company can come along and put all the code of that free program into a proprietary program. And it's lawful. It's permitted by the pushover license. So the result is, all of that code is now being used by a company to subjugate users. I put IBM here because this is what happened with Apache. Apache is a free program. It's released under the Apache 2.0 license, which is a free license, but it's a pushover license. It basically says, do almost anything you like. And so IBM said, thank you, and put the code into a proprietary web server program. I had seen this at the start of the GNU project. I knew this could happen. I realized that this could ruin everything because my goal was not just to make some nice programs and have people run them and like running them. No, my goal was to give them freedom. And I realized that if the license permitted companies to turn my code into proprietary software, then they would do it. And then there might be millions of people using proprietary versions of my code, just as there are millions of machines running proprietary versions of Apache. And from my point of view, that would be failure. So I developed the idea of copyleft. Copyleft is a general technique where you say to the users, yes, you're free to redistribute copies with or without changes, but the copies you redistribute must come with source code under the same license. So you must pass on to others the same freedoms that you got from me. This is the way I make sure that those middlemen can't deny freedom to all of you. Because they're not stupid, they're cunning. They're perfectly capable of developing improvements, better features, and if they're allowed to distribute that as a proprietary program, they would suck you into accepting the code without the freedom. So, I came up with a legal way of saying it's forbidden, and that's copyleft. When copyleft says to them, yes, you can redistribute this with your changes, with your additions and extensions, but the whole thing you must distribute as free software in the same way. The specific implementation of copyleft is the GNU General Public License, or GNU GPL. And the result of releasing under the GPL is that often companies join in extending the free version. In fact, IBM supports a lot of contribution to various GNU programs. IBM understands it's not allowed to make proprietary modified versions, so it doesn't. But there are improvements it wants to get into the program. So IBM pays other companies and they make these improvements and they're in our software. And we're grateful for that. It enables us to give people software that does more and respects their freedom. And that's the goal. Now, if all the software installed in your computer is free, then you still have to worry about running software that's not installed in your computer, at least not by you. And that happens nowadays in web browsing. Lots of web pages contain programs, typically written in JavaScript, and they get sent to your browser, which installs them temporarily and runs them. And there you are running non-free software. Well, some of those programs are free, but most of them are not. We didn't like running those non-free programs and not even knowing about it, so we developed Libre.js, which is an add-on for Firefox that checks each program to see if it's either free or trivial, and in those cases it's allowed to run. But if the program is non-free and non-trivial, Libre.js blocks it. And you can see on the screen that the page has blocked JavaScript code. Libre.js does one other thing. It searches the pages heuristically to find where and how to complain to the webmasters, so that you can complain very easily and quickly. The point is, you're supposed to complain. You're supposed to tell them, I couldn't use your website because it tried to make me run non-free JavaScript code. Please fix that. By the way, there is JavaScript malware. Another thing you need to watch out for is service as a software substitute. The reason non-free software is an injustice is it denies you control over your computing. But there's another way you can lose control over your computing. If you entrust it to somebody else's server, which has been set up with software chosen by that somebody else, then you don't control what that server does. If you tell that server to do your computing for you, some particular computing activity, well, you don't control that activity. The server's owner controls it. That's not right. It's equivalent to running a non-free program. And the only solution is don't do it. So don't use service as a software substitute. Now, what this means is using service as a software substitute and trusting your computing activity to somebody else's server is the equivalent of running a non-free program in your own computer. Either way, you don't control how the computing is done or what computing is actually done. But actually, the service as a software substitute is worse, because one byproduct of using it is the server has all your data. You have to send all the data to the server in order for it to do the job. But then it has all your data. Who knows what else it will do with that data? So it's equivalent to running a non-free program that spies on the user. But it's even worse. As I've mentioned, some non-free programs have universal backdoors where the proprietor at any time can send a command to change the program and change how the user's computing gets done. Well, with service as a software substitute, the server owner at any time can install different programs in the server, and that's okay. It's per computer. A person should be free to change the software in that computer. The injustice results from the fact that that computer is not doing per computing, it's doing other people's computing. And that's an injustice for them because they don't control their computing. In fact, it's equivalent to a universal backdoor. Just as the proprietor of a proprietary program with a universal backdoor can change how the user's computing gets done by sending a command to change the software, the owner of that server can change how the other people's computing is done by installing different software in that server. So using service as a software substitute, or SaaS, is effectively equivalent to running a non-free program which spies on the user and has a universal backdoor. In other words, it's equivalent to proprietary malware. So now you understand why not to entrust your computing activities to that. So we want to be free, but there are obstacles. One of them is that the companies that subjugate users make a lot of money. and they use that money to make it hard to escape. They construct social inertia, obstacles to ceasing to use that software. Now, one thing they do is they make a network effect. An especially nasty example of proprietary software is Skype. And the reason is anyone who's using Skype is probably doing it because of being pressured by friends, relatives, and coworkers. But once that person starts using Skype, that person becomes part of the pressure on others to use Skype. And this means it's an especial duty to refuse to use Skype. And another example of social inertia is when schools teach people to use a proprietary program, which they should never do. But look at this. We have schools and businesses, and the businesses mostly use Windows, and they say, we've got to use Windows because that's what schools teach people. And the schools are teaching Windows, and they say, we've got to teach Windows because that's what the businesses want. So each one is saying, we're waiting for the other to switch first. That's social inertia. Well, the schools, because they have a social mission, they have a duty to switch first. But really, all of them should make efforts to switch so as to defeat the social inertia. The way you overcome social inertia is by having a bunch of people with strong will. Enough will to say, I don't care what you want. I'm going to go over there. Those who want to follow me, follow me. So when these companies come to campus to sell or recruit, they should meet with protests. Another obstacle is the term open source. Open source is a slogan of a corporate subservient reaction against the free software movement. That was in 1998, 14 years after we started developing the GNU operating system. During the 1990s, in the free software community, there were two different political camps. There were those of us who saw this as an issue of freedom, a matter of ending unjust power. And then there were the people who liked free software and contributed because they liked it, but didn't see this as a matter of right and wrong. And there was a debate between these two different viewpoints. Newcomers to the community could see the debate, and that way they would find out about the free software movement. But in 1998, some of the people in the other camp coined the term open source so that they could disconnect our software from our moral philosophy. With their term open source that didn't in any way hint at an idea of freedom, they constructed a different discourse which was based only on practical values and which didn't say that proprietary software was wrong. So it avoided saying anything that executives might be uncomfortable with. That was the criterion. Make sure not to disturb the executives. Hush up forget about anything they might not like. So where we say it's your moral duty as a software developer to respect users' freedom to change and redistribute the programs that you distributed to them, open source people won't say that. Instead they say it might be in your practical interest to let the users change and redistribute the software because then they could improve the code quality. So the difference is at the deepest level. Values. For us, freedom and community. For them, convenience and code quality. Well, they have a right to their views. But it turns out that they had the support of the majority of the community, and the most of the businesses in the community, and the politicians and journalists mostly follow the money. So since then, it's rare to see the free software term even mentioned in the mainstream or tech press. They're only talking about open source. And that has been spread so much in association with our work that most people who have heard of me think I'm a supporter of open source. It's like calling Bernie Sanders a Democrat. So please don't ever let the idea that I advocate open source go by uncorrected. And as for you, well, your views are up to you so far. Who knows how much longer that will be in the US. But for the moment, you have the right to advocate free software, and you have the right to advocate open source. You have the right to not advocate either of them. But if you agree with the free software movement, please say so. Please say free software, free software, free software, Libra. Because if you say open source, you're supporting something else. So this is the problem we face. When people want to do an interview with me, I say, one condition is you've got to say I support free software and not connect me with or my work with open source. And the other is you've got to distinguish between gnu/linux, the complete system, and Linux, Torvalds' kernel. If they're going to get those things wrong, I'd rather not participate. You know, it's not true that all publicity is good publicity if they put in someone else's name instead of yours. But it's so common, this error. I've seen articles that called me the father of open source. So I sent a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived using artificial insemination with stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I explain about the free software movement and what it stands for, and that, of course, is the serious purpose of the letter, but it's nice to start with a joke. However, I can't do enough by myself. Your help is needed. Another obstacle is when the specs of the hardware are secret. How do we write free software to run the hardware if we are not allowed to know how to run the hardware? The manufacturer will say, here's a non-free driver or non-free firmware blob. Use it and shut up. But we can't use that non-free program. We reject installing it. So what we need is reverse engineering. Somebody very clever has got to figure out, by studying the interaction between the non-free driver and the physical hardware, what the commands of the hardware are. And write that down, and then someone else can write a free program to issue the commands. If you want to make a technical contribution that's really important, do it this way. Do reverse engineering. Help us figure out what we need to know about the hardware. But if you want to make the best possible contribution, it doesn't have to be technical. Don't assume that contributing to the free software movement means writing code. That's one way. Now, reverse engineering, because it's technically important to our progress, should be taught by schools like this one. Any school that's teaching technical subjects in the computer field should have a class in reverse engineering. It's also a good professional career. There's a lot of demand for it and not many people who do it. Speaking of schools, every school should teach exclusively free software. No exceptions. And the school should do this by using only free software in class. But the school class should also teach why it uses only free software. There's a civic reason for this, which is that the school has a social mission to educate good citizens of a society that is strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free. And in the field of computing, that means graduating people accustomed to using free software and thus ready to live in a free society. To teach a non-free program is to implant dependence. That is the opposite of the school's social mission. School should never do that. Teaching the kids to use non-free software is like teaching them to smoke tobacco. Never, never, never. But there's also a matter of moral education. We need to teach kids to cooperate, to help other people. So every class should have this rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the class, including the source code, in case someone wants to learn. Because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. So it's not permitted to bring proprietary software to this class. The school has to set a good example by following its own rule, which means bringing only free software to class and sharing copies, including source code, with everyone in the class that wants copies. With one exception, the exercises in reverse engineering. For those, the source code is the answer. So they shouldn't give out the answer until after the students are handed in their work. But there's another reason, and that is for the sake of education of programmers. You see, every program embodies knowledge. If it's proprietary, that knowledge is secret, withheld from the students. A non-free program is the enemy of the spirit of education, so it should not be tolerated in a school except for reverse engineering, which is the way of getting the knowledge out from where it is concealed. But free software offers its knowledge to the students. So schools should insist, for this reason also, on free software. And how do you learn to write good, clear code? By reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Well, only free software gives you the chance to read the code of real programs, large programs we really use. Then you've got to write lots of code. To learn to write code for large programs, you have to write lots of code for large programs. But how do you do that when you haven't yet mastered writing such programs? You've got to write changes to existing large programs. First small ones, then bigger ones. For small changes, then bigger changes, all of them in large programs. Well, only free software gives you the chance to write changes of whatever size in the large programs we really use. Every school can offer the possibility of mastering the craft of programming if it is a free software school. This school, like all schools, should migrate to free software. It should teach only free software. And it's up to those of you who have a relationship with the school to campaign for this and demand it. If you're a student or a teacher or an administrator or an employee, or not so much here but for lower levels of schooling, the parent of the student. It's your responsibility to demand that the school stop teaching proprietary software and teach only free software, and to organize with others to campaign for this. You've got to teach other people what's at stake so they understand the issue, so that some of them will join in. It's a mission that must be achieved, and you're the ones who are there. I can show you what has to be done and why. I can't do it for you. You're going to have to do it. Human rights depend on each other. If you lose one, it becomes harder to defend the rest. Now that we use computing for so many important purposes, free software, in other words, the control of our computing, has become one of the essential human rights that we need in order to defend the rest. And sometimes that requires a sacrifice. Fortunately, in this field, they tend to be small sacrifices. But you've got to be ready to make them. I've encountered people who responded when I said you really should switch from that proprietary software to free software. They said, well, when you show me a free program that is 100% as convenient and powerful as this proprietary program, then I'll switch. What they're really saying is the amount of sacrifice they will make to have freedom is zero. For them, freedom's value is zero. And I can't change their minds. I can only point to them as examples of foolish values. I hope you value freedom more than they do, because if not, you won't have any for very long. So how do you help our cause? If you're a good programmer, write free software. I suggest you contribute to 15 other existing projects before you try to start your own. That way you'll learn the right way to run a project, so that when you start one, you'll be able to do it right. But suppose you're not a programmer. You can do other important things. It's not just about programming. For instance, you can organize the movement. You can become a speaker and give talks like this. We need more speakers. It's really important. Give speeches to small groups, and when you feel you're doing it well, make an audio recording and send it to me. Or you can be one of the people who does things like keeping track of the local group's membership list and planning when there will be a meeting or an action and inviting people and seeing who will come. That's really important too. We've got to learn, once again, to organize civically. We've got to do that for free software and for all the other kinds of freedom that have been taken away from us. You can persuade schools and governments. Regarding schools, look at gnu.org/education. Regarding governments, look at gnu.org/government for why government agencies must use exclusively free software and how they should go about doing this. If you're an expert user, help other users. Start a gnu+linux user group or participate in an existing one. And if the existing one erroneously calls itself a Linux user group, you can participate and explain to them why that name is mistaken and why it's right for them to change it. And you can say free software. Just saying free software rather than open source is very important, because it shows people that what's really at stake here. That it's not just a matter of development methodologies and improving code quality. It's a matter of freedom that is essential for us. Now, I have a little more to say about privacy. You see, people are inhibited by being watched. And you don't have to be a terrorist or a criminal to be afraid somebody will take you for one. After Snowden, a great hero, told us how much the US government was spying on us, all of us, the rate of accesses to certain Wikipedia pages, for instance, terrorist, bomb, Al-Qaeda, various others, went down by 20%. Masses of people were frightened because they were being watched. You might like to think that you have nothing to hide, but that's silly. Of course you do. For one thing, lawyers estimate that the average American commits 3 felonies a day without knowing it. But if the government's always watching, it will have data all ready for a fishing expedition against you at any time. And when you have something that you don't want to tell the government, at that point you might think of trying to get your privacy back. But if every day 100 people think, I want my privacy back, there will be too few on any given day. We've got to organize now, all of us, whether we've got anything today that we don't want to tell the government or not. But there's some people who really do have something to hide because they're dissidents or whistleblowers. And it's not just they who need to be able to keep it private. We need them to be able to do so. That's what democracy requires. Democracy means that the people control the state and what it does. But in order to control what the state does, we have to know what the state does. The state tends to keep its actions secret. How could we possibly control them? We depend on whistleblowers, heroes like Snowden. 3 cheers for Edward Snowden. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! So, we depend on them, but the state tends to call them criminals and put them in prison if it can figure out who they are. And if the state always knows who goes where and who talks with whom, then it can always find the whistleblowers. And so it'll be so dangerous that we won't have enough whistleblowers. So we've got to make sure it's safe to be a whistleblower. We've got to make sure the state can't tell who goes where and can't tell who talks with whom. And that means we've got to knock down the level of general surveillance to the point where the state can't figure that out. We suffer from more surveillance now in the US than they did in the former Soviet Union. It's far too much. We've got to get rid of that surveillance. And the only effective way to do it is by requiring systems to be designed not to collect data about people. It doesn't work to try to solve this problem by limiting the use of the data that's collected. Because when somebody is accused of a crime, the government can always justify getting the data and using it. So, in order to find a whistleblower, all it has to do is say that whistleblowing is a crime, which is exactly what Obama's war on whistleblowers has been doing. And I suppose the trolls will just escalate the war on whistleblowers, making it even worse. So, we've got to, in other words, limits on accessing the data tend not to limit the case that's the most dangerous to society. So we've got to insist that systems be designed not to surveil us. This is one reason to refuse to use Uber or Lyft. or any other transportation service that demands to identify people. For instance, Amtrak. Ever since Amtrak started demanding to identify passengers, I haven't taken it. We could make it stop if we organize. So, in gnu.org/philosophy/surveillance-vs-democracy.html, you can see lots of different suggestions for how to make various systems operate and not keep track of people. It's too many different suggestions to mention here. But this is absolutely essential. It's essential for democracy. In gnu.org, you'll find a lot more about free software. gnu.org/distros describes the distributions of gnu/linux, which ones are free and which are not. gnu.org/licenses tells all about free software licensing. gnu.org/gnu describes the history of GNU. gnu.org/philosophy has many articles about specific philosophical questions relating to free software. gnu.org/help lists many different ways to help us. There are many methods to contribute. Whatever your skills are, there are things you can do with those skills. Don't give up just because, say, you're not a great programmer. Contribute in a different way. And gnu.org/proprietary lists the dozens of cases of proprietary malware we know about. I think it's actually around 140 different cases in there now, organized in several different ways. FSF.org contains useful resources for using, distributing, and developing free software. It also has political campaigns you can sign. It has a shop where you can get these things and other things that aren't here today. You can also become a member of the Free Software Foundation. But you can do that here because I'm here. You can become a member and pay cash. I'll give you a card if you want to join. So now it's time to present my other identity. By the way, I recently found out what Catholics do in church. They play cards. They play so much that they develop a specific repetitive stress injury called the Eucharist. I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as an extensible text editor I had written, which developed into a way of life for many users as it was extended so much they could do all their computing without ever exiting Emacs. And then it became a church with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs, which you might find amusing to visit. In the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between several versions of Emacs, and we also have saints but no gods. Instead of gods, we adore the one true editor, Emacs. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must pronounce the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. Then, if you become a real expert user, you can celebrate that with our ceremony, the Fubar Mitzvah, in which you chant a portion of our sacred scriptures, that is the system source code. We also have the cult of the Virgin of Emacs, which refers to anyone who has never used Emacs. According to the Church of Emacs, offering someone the opportunity to lose Emacs virginity is a blessed act. We also have the Emacs pilgrimage, which consists of invoking all the commands of Emacs in alphabetical order. There is a breakaway Tibetan sect which claims that it's sufficient to invoke them automatically under the control of a script, and they do that repetitively millions of times. But the Mother Church holds that to gain spiritual merit from the Emacs pilgrimage, you must type them by hand. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with other churches that I won't name. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever diabolic proprietary operating systems have possessed computers under your control or set up for your regular use, and install a wholly free operating system. And then use and install exclusively free software with and on the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint, and you'll have the right to wear a halo if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. There's a traditional rivalry between Emacs and the other editor, VI. So people have occasionally asked me whether in the Church of Emacs the use of VI is a sin. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. A few years ago I went to China, and some VI users proposed to get together and attack me. What can I say? Apparently violence begins with VI. People have occasionally asked me whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no Halo, this is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. Thank you.